There it is.
This is Mike Guardia, and you are watching the Break It Down show.
Man, I love having you on the show. You write interesting books with interesting people, and so I'm thrilled to have you on the show to talk about the latest one. Let me hold this book up here.
Thank you, Pete.
Bandit. And I'm going to get one of these from my nephew because he's young. He's just going to be in high school next year, and he loves military stuff. His dad, who's passed on, was a Marine, and he loves his uncle. I was an Army guy, and so he loves stuff like this, and he loves to like know more than his friends. And so you've already sold one book, because I'm going to send that to my nephew in our hometown. But yeah, man, thanks for writing this thing. What brought you to the MiG side of the battle?
You're right. So this, in a lot of ways, I think grew out of the earlier book that I did on the MiG-29. And, I was always fascinated by Soviet aircraft. And in particular, I was drawn to a lot of the latter-day Soviet fighters. And I think what really compelled me to write about it was that, when I was looking for books on the subject, there's not a lot of detailed combat histories that are readily accessible to Western audiences. And, if you do have a book out there, it's typically the kind that's been out of print forever and a day. And if you're lucky to find a copy anywhere, it goes for like $250 or something like that. And I'm just like, okay, well, there's definitely an interest. There's definitely a niche market for aviation technology. There's a niche market for military aviation. And I think the broader military history community in general just really likes stories about fighter pilots. So I figured, okay, if I can amass enough sources to tell the story from the side of those who are flying this jet on the other side of the Iron Curtain, I can make that accessible to Western audiences. And I can say, well, hey, being a Westerner myself, I will fully acknowledge that these planes had their faults, and qualitatively, they weren't quite up to par with anything that was inside of the NATO inventory. But you find out that it's a little bit more nuanced, that, even though the plane did have a lot of weaknesses, and you see that this is particularly true with the MiG-29, the bad reputation that the plane got, it wasn't completely undeserved, but there were a lot of little nuances that skewed its combat performance record. And, if you were to actually look at it in a head-to-head matchup, while, Western fighters still have the edge, man, the MiG-29 was just the most resilient underdog. And if you look at all the different combat roles it's played, from Eastern Europe to the Middle East to the subcontinent, I mean, it's doing missions that its original Soviet designers never would have thought of in a million years. And you really see a lot of the geopolitical shifts take a very interesting turn, where truth really does become a lot stranger than fiction. That is what led me to at least the story of the MiG-29.
Interesting. Yeah. One of the things that we find, I talk about a lot about baseball, right? And a lot of baseball legacy is reputation, not necessarily performance, right? And so when you have an F whatever doing amazing things in a movie, oh boy, us Americans, we love that. It's cool, right? And then of course, who's the bad guy going to be? And it's going to be the MiG. And so there is a warping in terms of like, what are they capable of, or what's a Mirage capable of, or the Swedes have a wonderful fighter jet. You're not going to, but we don't think of it in those terms. We think it's like Apex and that's it. But that's never it, because there's never a Tomcat F-16. It's Tomcat F-16 and then letters as to how they made it better. And the same thing for MiGs.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And, you really do see that with the MiG-29. Now, of course, with the MiG, any successive iteration, there's only so much that you can actually do to the airframe. And then, of course, the export variants are never going to be as good as the top quality stuff that's built at home. But, through each one of these variants, they've gotten a little bit stronger. They've gotten a little bit better. And you really see in a lot of the latter day variants, especially the ones that are still flying in Ukraine and the ones that Ukrainian pilots are still flying against Russia, you see integrations that really just make you scratch your head and say, wow, necessity really is the mother of all innovation, because you have these Cold War era fighters that are being adapted to carry NATO spec ammunition. And because the original onboard interface wasn't designed to handle things like the AGM-88 missile, you have these off-the-shelf Apple iPads that are being integrated into the cockpit, and that's how the pilots are controlling it. And you're just like, what?
Yeah.
Uh,
It's the amount of, we were talking the other day. I had a Green Beret on the show, and he said like
uh,
the warrior you saw, I think he said in 2005, is a completely differently outfitted guy now, and it's not
mm,
just more armor; it's like computers everywhere on your, and it's like
right.
this more and more a cyborg in a lot of ways, and
Uh-huh.
and for sure that's true in airplanes. But before we dive into that, I want to back up for a sec. I
Yeah.
was reading through my grandfather's logbook. He flew Hellcats in World War II, right?
Mhm.
But he was just young enough that when he got there, the war was still going, but it was largely won, right?
Mhm.
And so he was there to do things. And so what's he doing? He's doing all kinds of stuff, but he's flying test missions. They're getting up in the air and like turn the radar on and use the radar because now we have
Yeah.
radar. Now we're going to do more night flying. Oh, and by the way, air to air and air to ground missiles are being tested. So this, as the war is going on, innovation is being applied, and new pilots are being the first ones to ever turn a radar on inside of a Hellcat.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Uh, I guess that's always the case, though, right? Like we're
it
always
is.
adding some new doohickey or something.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, they're always trying to trying to find ways to adapt. The spirit of the innovation itself, I think, is incredible because the best way that I can describe them. I don't know if this is the best descriptor. It's probably just the best one that I can think of. They're really guerrilla style solutions because it's like you don't have fancy hardware that's available, so you kind of have to jerry rig something. In a sense, be a modern day MacGyver and try and figure out what you can pull off the shelf and try to integrate into this plane to make it somewhat stand on par with these new 5th gen fighters that are coming out of all of your adversaries' factories.
One of the things that struck me too was looking at this. If I just did that and pulled it away, you'd be like, "Oh, is that a Tomcat?" Because if you, unless you're really good at
Yeah,
recognition, and I hide
yeah,
everything, and I just showed
yeah,
you that, it's like,
yeah.
but you are kind of bound to the science of the time, right?
Right. Yeah, you are, and yeah, that's one of the things that a lot of the Ukrainian pilots have actually commented on. They were saying that the challenge for them with the MiG-29 is not necessarily its quality as a fighter. They said it's a good and it's a resilient plane, but they also said it's very doctrinally outdated. They said that we're flying what was the best of the Warsaw Pact's 4th generation fighters, but we're going up against these Sukhoi Su-27s and these Su-30s, Su-35s, which technically are still 4th gen, but they're 4th gen plus plus. They've been upgraded, and we're also having to contend with a lot of this 5th generation technology. So the problem for us is that we are bound by the technology, and even these MacGyver style solutions that we can come up with, like putting iPads in the cockpit, they're really only going to do so much. It's kind of ironic because even though they were at a technological disadvantage, the ferocity of what these MiG-29s were able to accomplish in the opening days of the air campaign were at least enough to get the attention of Russian Air Command and say, okay, well, it would probably be a more cost beneficial move for us. It would be better for our own economy of force if we were to let drones do all the heavy lifting when it came to all of these coordinated air attacks. And that's why for the better part of about 2 years now, you've seen most of the action in the air in the skies above Ukraine being Ukrainian fighters going up against these unmanned aerial vehicles.
Yeah, which boy, we were talking about Bosnia off mic. That is a different world because we were
Yeah,
there, and if we were going to be negative, we were there to
yeah,
prove that the what was that thing called? Whatever that early drone was, that it didn't work, so that we could
right.
kill that program or
Uh,
or validate it. And it was both. It was both things, right? Where those drones crashed a lot, but they also gathered the most feed data we'd ever had from a drone, and that's
mm-hmm.
96. It's 30 years later, but boy, what a jump in terms of
Right.
how war is fought.
Yeah.
It's so crazy,
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is. And yeah, and also one of the things that I've noticed on at a physical level was that, we are 30 years later, and the social media aspect of the war, I think, has taken warfare to an entirely new dimension. And probably not the most accurate descriptor, but I think in a lot of ways, the Russia-Ukraine war has become a Gen Z style conflict because you have soldiers that are updating their Instagram profiles real time when they're on the battlefield, trying to stream to all their followers while they're in the middle of a firefight. Like, hey, here I am, I'm fighting the Russians. # they can't kill me. kind of stuff. And there was even one pilot that I talk about in the book, him Rushlov, was inadvertently shot down, not technically shot down, but fired on a Russian drone, and the Russian drone was laced with this reactive armor. So when his missile hit it, the reactive armor, kind of like what we see on a tank, it exploded outward. Well, the shrapnel ended up peppering his plane. It went through his cockpit. He had no choice but to eject. But after he ejected on the ground, even though his face was all bloodied up, he still had enough energy to take out his iPhone. He took a selfie. He posted the selfie to IG. He's like, "Yeah, I ejected, but they can't kill me." And with that same iPhone, he actually calls his squadron commander. He's like, "Hey, sir, I would call you on the distress radio, but I don't want Russians to intercept that, so I'm just calling you on my iPhone. My last known position was at the intersection of so-and-so. So if you could send a rescue team out here, that'd be great." And I'm just thinking, man, that is such a 21st century Gen Z move right there. And totally. I'm not making fun. I actually think that's pretty impressive. Yeah.
Well, we have to. Like in the world of intel, everything's compromised. You start with that assumption. Everything's compromised, and so all the information is perishable. Mm-hmm. But this generation, it's like everything's publishable.
Right.
And so everything you do, if you misbehave, if you win, if whatever, and it's crazy. Getting back to the MiG-29, when you build a world-class fighter, you envision its role, ground support, air-to-air, whatever it's going to be. But so often, war is so infrequent that it really largely doesn't do it. Like most snipers in the Army don't really fire any shots in combat, right? Because it's just not used very often. So how used has the MiG-29 been, and what era did that happen?
Well, it's been used, I think, a lot more frequently than even the top-level Soviet designers had anticipated. And it's ironic because in more ways than one, it was actually purposely designed to be second best. It was, they said, okay, well, we have a new generation of fighters coming online. Mm-hmm. So we need a really big, strong expeditionary fighter that can stay aloft for a long time, that has a high endurance, that can turn and also maneuver on a dime. We're going to let the Sukhois do that. But when we have the latest project for the MiG Design Bureau, okay, well, the new MiG-29, we're going to make it primarily a defensive counter-air fighter, or DCA fighter. So it's not going to be an expeditionary fighter. It's not going to have a very big endurance. It's going to be tethered to about a 100-kilometer radius from any airfield. We're really going to try and use it as a point defense interceptor, and that's about as good as it's going to get. Now, it's going to fulfill that role, and we think it's going to fulfill that role very well, but it's not going to be to the caliber of what our priority budget is for the Su-27. And in a real way, I think that's what led to a lot of the initial bad press, if you will, behind it, because they knew that it was a fighter that was designed to be on a very short tether, and that it would only be more maneuverable at slower speeds, and that it would only do its job most effectively if it was at lower altitudes. So with that in mind, you had the MiG-29 come online, but the first very hot battles that it did were really beyond the scope of what its performance metrics would allow. So, you really had the MiG-29 have its first baptism by fire in Desert Storm. And for better or for worse, even though the MiG-29 was getting a lot of hype in the American intel community, it was a combination of the Iraqis' skill and also their maintenance program that sabotaged and kind of the tendons, if you will, of the MiG-29 before the fight had even started, which is why they with so many MiGs in that conflict, and it was just getting destroyed by F-15s left and right. So trying to put a defensive counter-air fighter into more of an offensive counter-air strategy, really hamstrung it at first. Then, you had that bad press for the MiG-29 coming right out of the box after Desert Storm. And then, of course, when we get into the Yugoslav wars, the performance isn't that much better, even though the pilots had a lot more skill. If you take Serbia, for instance, Serbia, which was really trying to be the continuing legal successor to Tito's Yugoslavia, they were really putting a lot of pride into their MiG-29 fleets, but the arms embargo and the lack of availability of spare parts, even on the black market, was really was really messing with their maintenance program, to the point where, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that any F-15 or F-16 was going to make a pretty short order of the MiG-29. You have those first two conflicts there where it is doing a more of a beefed up defensive role, but it's hamstrung. And ironically enough, you really see it shine in places that are beyond geopolitically where the designers had intended it to be. And what's even more ironic is that the MiG shining moments were actually in countries that were very low on the client priority list. And these were the bottom of the barrel variant MiGs that they wanted to push off on these other countries. Yet, ironically, these are the ones that are actually having the best combat record. Because if you take the Indian Air Force, for instance, during the Kargil War of '99, you had the MiG-29 performing superbly, and everybody was keeping their fingers crossed, hoping that a MiG-29 was going to take on a Pakistani F-16. Unfortunately, that never happened. But you had MiG-29s that were running interference for ground troops. And nobody in the original MiG Design Bureau had ever intended it to be a ground attack aircraft. So you had it performing very well there. And you also had it performing well in a lot of these brush fire conflicts in Africa. You had the conflicts in Sudan, where, the Sudanese MiG-29s were intercepting, were interdicting these guerrilla forces on the ground. And then you also had, now this is one that's really interesting, and I'm kind of surprised it doesn't get a lot more coverage in the modern day historiography. But Ethiopia and Eritrea, I think a lot of people forget that they had a pretty significant border war that went on for quite a while. And Russia, for its part, they really were playing both sides for chumps, because they said, okay, well, here is Ethiopia, here's Eritrea. Both of them, of course, were once, part of the same political union, and they were one of our client states. So you know what? Hey, Ethiopia, you can keep the Sukhois that you have. We'll send our technicians and our trainers and our mercenary pilots to help you with your Sukhois. But Eritrea, gosh, you got the short end of the stick, but you got all these MiG-29s. You know what? We'll help you out too. So for a convenient nominal fee, we'll send people from the Mikoyan Design Bureau. We'll send our own mercenary pilots there, and we'll help you out. So it was really Russia cashing in on the conflict, and in a roundabout way, in a very ironic and sardonic way, I got to hand it to him, because I applaud you for learning capitalism so well. Yeah. And the silver lining for the Eritrean Air Force was that, despite the fact that they were starting off behind the 8-ball with these MiG-29s that were just barely maintained, and pilots who, for an ironic pun, were given a crash course in how to fly these planes, that they actually handled themselves very well, and they were able to rack up some pretty impressive kill records, and at least keep the Eritrean Air Force intact to the point where they could broker a peace solution.
There's for sure, if you're on the ground and anything flies, a helicopter with nothing in it, you're like, oh shit, what is that? And you don't want to bet your life that it's not armed. So even a second-rate fighter that flies overhead, you're going to respond to it. And maybe eventually you put. Think about this, Mike. How many flyovers with nothing happens from a MiG-29 in your troop before you start to stick your neck out and be like, they're not really going to do anything? Like, you would never do it. You'd like, no way. There's a jet up, button down. So even just the presence is powerful, and then any kind of capacity on top of that, and of course. Yeah, you can figure something out. How much has Russia used it before this current conflict?
Yeah, Russia had actually used it for homeland defense, and it was one of those silent warriors that got a lot of press throughout the 1980s. Never really got to engage in combat in terms of in terms of its country of origin, because you had it come online in the 1980s. And it was flying its, they were flying their border security patrols, around Soviet airspace. You had all of the Eastern Bloc, the Warsaw Pact air forces, who were flying it likewise. Just doing these racetrack patterns around the Iron Curtain. And then when the Iron Curtain fell, it was something that was really for homeland defense. And when I started researching it, I was actually shocked to find that the MiG-29 in Russian service really didn't play a role in the war in Chechnya. And I was kind of expecting that it would, because I knew that the Su-25 was doing a lot of the heavy lifting there for ground attack missions. But I was like, wow, I can't believe they didn't put the MiG-29 onto anything over there. And then of course you had the conflict in Georgia, which was over almost as quickly as it started, and you had some MiG-29 presence there. But really, where you see it start to shine is Ukraine, which of course part of the former Soviet Union. But the Russian MiG-29s, for their part, they've largely taken a back seat to the current war in Ukraine. The Russian MiG-29s, of course, Ukrainian MiGs, they're still doing the heavy lifting. But by the time the war in Ukraine kicked off, they already knew that it was the frontline, 4th and 5th gen Sukhois that were really going to be doing most of the heavy lifting. So ironic. Its country of origin never used it all that much.
Yeah, and that always begs the question, was this a successful fighter for Russia? I mean, obviously, if you're going to deploy it as a money-making asset and send pilots and services, okay, maybe, but was this a good decision for them, do you think?
Yeah, I think in a downstream effect it was. I think that it was a right fighter for where the Soviet air defense doctrine was at the time. And then even after the Soviet Union collapsed, it was a good tool for them to maintain the Russian homeland air defense. And I think it was good ace in the hole to have, because I mean, I think a lot of us remember throughout the 90s, we were thinking that Russia was out for the count, and they were on the verge of a civil war in 93. They had that very rough spot in Chechnya for a while. So we're thinking, okay, because they're barely hanging on by a thread, it's probably good to at least have something that can defend the homeland airspace. I think the downstream effect, how it was beneficial for them, was that they were able to by pushing it off to a bunch of export clients, and the export clients, through its continued use and its continued upgrades and services, that they were able to make it economically feasible for Russia, just because they're the ones sending the technicians, and they're the ones providing a lot of the technical feedback.
Kind of bound by the time. By the way, everybody, we're talking about Red Bandit. Here's the book. Okay. And the link is right here down below. You know what I always say, buy two, buddy, read this. And if you got a young nephew like I do, buy it for him so you can read about it. Because look, I'm an Intel guy, right? Yeah. And I thoroughly enjoyed reading this thing, man. It was fun. It's got pictures, and honestly, it's an easy read. Yeah. One of the things that's happened during the evolution of this plane and our careers is the concept of joint and combined joint going together, fighting. And so that means that you have to, with the jet, I would imagine you have to log on to whatever network's relevant and whatever assets are in the air. And just for anybody else, I know Mike knows this, but when you go out on a patrol, on a ground patrol, right? You brief what's above you, stacked. Is there a Raven drone? Is there a Predator drone above that? Oh, there's going to be Kiowas in the area. No Black Hawk, whatever. And then, what fast movers are up there. So on all these things are communicating in some form or fashion so that they don't smash into each other. They're sharing intel and assets, all these things. So how does that work when you have a Russian platform fighter talking to an AWACS, who's talking to a JTAC, who's, that's amazing to me that we can get that sorted out. But obviously we must, because it must happen. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and that's actually been one of the more interesting footnotes of the war in Ukraine, because, to that point, I think they were relying on all of the GCI stations. AWACS was really a luxury that the Ukrainian Air Force didn't have at first, and they would have to rely on these ground intercepts. And, I think as NATO finally started to get more involved in the conflict as a proxy supplier, they said, okay, well, if we're going to be supplying these munitions, then, we're going to have to figure out ways to get this old Warsaw Pact era equipment to talk to some of our newest technology. And that's really what facilitated, in more ways than one, to find these off-the-shelf solutions, because, we're in an active air war. You can't really take 6 months to deconstruct the cockpit and try to put in a new avionics suite. So they said, okay, well, if we can jerry rig iPad, I think that'll be the first step. And to sync comms up to any number of AWACS that are in the air at the time. Okay, well, if we're going to work around that and we have to put them on a zipper net, then we have to find a way to try to jerry rig, whatever the airborne equivalent to a PRC radio is, and and try to put that in there. Try to route all the wirings that we can, and try to put a data bus on there that's going to encrypt all of the traffic, so that by the time it gets to the AWACS, it'll get there in real time and it won't be intercepted by any of the Russians' W capabilities.
Right.
and it's busy because because they know that they want to integrate all these systems, and they know that it's going to take a task to try to sync up stuff that was previously divided by the Iron Curtain. Yeah. And at the same time, they know, okay, well, full on integration with all of the professional grade tech support that we need is going to take a long time, and time is not a luxury that the Ukrainian Air Force has. So we have to get creative, and that's how we think of these MacGyver solutions, to try to make sure that they're getting good SA and they're getting good W capabilities. And for the audience out there, SA in this context is situational awareness.
Thank you. And EO is EW, electronic warfare, and all these things. Also, by the way, when you think about manned space in a project like an airplane or a tank. I'm just talking to the audience. There's not a lot. If you're in a tank, it's not like, I'm going to stretch around and take a nap and hang up my hammock. So it's none of that. So when you are adding a system, a classified portable system, to a cockpit in an airplane, it's got to go somewhere. It's got to plug in somewhere. It's got to get powered somewhere. And there might be some expansion capacity built in, but again, you have to rig this thing, like maybe even like pop riveting a swing arm into the dashboard, and you swing that thing back, and then of course you do a high G turn. You got to throw your arm out. That's the fix. Just the whole. But I mean, that's how these things go, right? Like you come up with a kooky idea, and you really are pop riveting things into place, and then you'll worry about a more elegant solution later. That's the nature of combat. So when you think about the MiG-29 and its place with all of the great jets, does it have one, or is it like a rank below still?
Well, I think it does have a rank among the world's greatest fighter jets. It's just it's the member of the club that has a checkered past, but gets respect from everybody else inside the club simply because of its resilience and its adaptability, and in more ways than one, its overall defiance. Because one of the themes that I was coming across in all of these different conflicts that I was researching was that MiG-29 really comes out as an ironically defiant plane, because even though some level, the pilots and the crews know that it's starting behind the 8-ball, it really is the story of the fighter that would never back down, and and it would even turn a few heads and surprise a few people along the way. Those old up warriors that's in the club and gets respect from everybody else there on account of the fact that he, like everybody knows, that he's been through a lot, and despite everything that's been thrown at him, he's somehow remained relevant to everything that's going on. I think I'm trying to think of a good analogy. Probably would be that old beat up Ford F-150 that your neighbor has had for close to 50 years, and everybody knows that he probably should have gotten rid of it about 20 years ago, but despite the rusted out fenders and the and the fact that the engine is burning oil, he's still keeping it in good driving condition, and it still gets the job done no matter what he needs it to do. Yeah.
He doesn't win any car shows, but then he shows up and everybody gathers around it. They're like, look at this thing. I love it. Yeah. I mean, when you think about like the longevity, because this jet has been around for a long time, right?
Yeah,
and so,
it sure has.
It's the U-2 is ancient. All of the C-130 class of those things have been around forever.
Oh yeah,
the B-52, but this thing's getting up there in age.
Yeah, it really has. So and that's that I think is part of the tough reality that a lot of pilots and aviation enthusiasts have been wrestling with for probably the better part of 15 years now. You know, we know that the F-15, the F-16, a lot of the legacy fighters that current generations, millennials and older, have grown up knowing, and, you know, have these long established service records. They really are reaching the end of their service life. And it's ironic because on the one hand, you know that the age and the mileage is a liability, but it's still getting the job done, and it's still performing remarkably anywhere in the world we send it. So you know, it's by the current estimates, and, you know, these date projections could probably change within the next 5 to 10 years, but they say that by 2035 or by 2040, we will have phased out the last of our current 4th gen fighters, you know, F-15, F-16. We're going to be having the F-22 and the F-35 do a lot of the heavy lifting. And for better or for worse, the MiG-29 is going to find itself in that same boat. I know that before too long, Ukraine itself is going to completely phase it out in favor of the F-16. And yeah, that was another geopolitical shocker. I don't think anyone would have anticipated an F-16 being in a former Eastern Bloc Air Force.
Well, didn't you see Maverick?
Oh, of course, yeah, yeah.
Couldn't resist.
Oh, of course, yeah. But you know, so I think it's going to start seeing a precipitous, a very precipitous drop off here within the next 5 years. And probably going out to 2040, I think the only countries that will still have it in service at that point will be the smaller regional air forces that don't really have priority access to anything bigger. But even then, I think it's going to be numbered, because, you know, I think of how long some other planes have stuck around well beyond their best buy date, and there were some that are shockers. Matter of fact, here's a story I can tell you. So this was, I think I have the year right, but if not, I will correct date later. So my dad actually told me a story of a time when he did an exchange when he was in the Army, and he did I think it was a week long or a month long exchange program with the Army of the Dominican Republic. And this was 1979. Goes down to DR. And you know, he meets all the officers, you know, he sees all the training. But one of the things that caught his eye, and even so much so that I remember he got a picture of this, he was thrilled and actually kind of shocked that Dominican Air Force in 1979 was still using the P-51 Mustang as its primary fighter. And I'm thinking, okay, this is a prop-driven fighter from World War II. And here we are almost 40 years later, and the Air Force of the Dominican Republic is using this as their primary fighter and interceptor. It's like, I mean, the P-51 was a great plane for its time, but you know, if this tries to go up against like a Cuban MiG, I mean, it's game over.
Right.
You know? So yeah, so I think if I were to use that story as an analogy, and, you know, forward into the 21st century, yeah, there are going to be a few hangers on to the MiG-29. I think well into the 2040s, but you know, even then, it's going to be like, okay, well, we need to give this a more dignified send off and try and find something a little more modern.
I mean, still 70 years. Wow. You know, I mean, that's an incredible life for any kind of combat platform. I mean, okay, something as simple as a gun, sure, that can go on for a long time. But man, just to throw an airplane in there. And I guess like the big difference between like the Mustang and all of the piston engine type planes is jets came along and made it status function. I read an article one time where they did, I don't know if this was theoretic or if this was in the air, but they did a bit of dogfighting, and a biplane was so hard to see, so slow and turnable, liftable, moving around, that modern jets could reliably lose to them because of they're so obsolete, they don't belong on the battlefield. And a crafty look. Would you want to be in a stick and cloth airplane against the Tomcat? No. You know, but there was something like there wasn't enough heat signature, you know, and then like because they had so much, it was crazy to read about that. Obviously, not a good strategy to take on, but because while you were up in the air doing aerobatics and everything, they'd be just destroying the the airport. You could do nothing about it.
Right.
But that's kind of funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you think about the lifespan of a jet, 70 years is probably pretty good. The what's making the modern ones so much better, like the fifth and sixth generations,
Right.
as these things come along? What is really is it the speed? Is it the over the horizon fighting? What is making the difference to make them obsolete?
Well, I think a lot of it starts with the stealth technology that they're incorporating into a lot of the current fifth gen fighters. You know, I mean, I remember right around the time of Desert Storm, and even though I was very young when the conflict happened, the thing that stands out in my mind was all of the press that the stealth fighter and you know, this was going to be the hallmark of space age technology. And stealth technology was so new and was so expensive that, you know, we're only going to prioritize it for a small group of strategic aircraft. But, you know, I think as time goes on and as the technology becomes more scalable and it also becomes a lot more inexpensive to reproduce, that you know, we got to a point where we said, okay, well, if we've had such a great track record with the F-117 and the B-2, then we can make that technology widely available. We can incorporating it into things like the F-22 and the F-35. So I think the stealth technology, the low observable technology, is the thing that's really going to make the fifth gen stand out as much. But you know, apart from that, you also have onboard avionics suites that are just light years ahead of what any fourth gen fighter could do, and the maneuverability, a lot of the solid state fly-by-wire systems. It all makes for something that can turn on a dime and just make it very difficult for anything that is other than fifth gen to really stand on its own. And you know, not that I take cues from Hollywood, but the F-14 take on an SU-57. We do know that theoretically it's possible, but yeah, it's very much at a disadvantage if you're looking at the fourth gen versus fifth gen debate.
Right. So it sounds like it's quite a few things. I mean, just the physical nature of the airplane is even making the other ones obsolete. Yeah, that's interesting. The other thing, I was reading Andrews and Wilson, the Tom Clancy book. And in that book, I think it was Andrews and Wilson. It was one of the current Tom Clancy books. And it was about magnets and the ability to blink the plane out of existence because these magnets did some kind of, and all these things are based in reality. You know, they're not that far ahead. They're not that impossible things. And it's interesting to think not only is the plane's nature to be signature reducing, but to be able to bolt something on. And maybe that gives an F-14 or an F-18 some extra life, but just that capacity alone, coupled with the stealthy nature of a modern airplane, it just makes it even harder to survive in an older plane.
Right.
Yeah. Now, you talk a little bit about Yugoslavia. We mentioned it a little before too.
Yeah.
When a country like Yugoslavia breaks apart, and look, there's a world where Russia breaks apart, or breaks into smaller things, right? So what happens with the jets? How do these countries, these proto countries, navigate the materiel aspect of this?
Yeah, it was really kind of a sad story because, you know, if you look at the breakup of Yugoslavia, had a lot of people who were harboring grudges that had lasted centuries, and I think once Tito died, they were ready to drop any pretense at all of trying to be nice to each other. So just given all that resentment, you know, given all of the resentment that was being harbored, you know, amongst the Croats and the Serbs and the Bosnians, really going to make it hard. Really what you saw was that when Yugoslavia was starting to fracture along those ethnic lines, whatever was within the immediate control of the Croatians or the Serbians, whatever was inside their recognized borders at the time, they pretty much took hold of. And they said, okay, well, if we have X amount of MiG-29s over here, but the Croats have so many over here, well, then we're going to resort to espionage and stealing in order to get the parts that we need to keep our fleet airborne, but to keep theirs on the ground. So so it was a question of what can we get that's within our immediate control. That's step number one. And then step number two is how can we sabotage what we know is on the other side of the border, and how can we convince any outside parties, if they get involved, to support us at the expense of someone else. And I think in more ways than one, Serbia was starting off from a position of strength because they had those historical ties to Russia. For the better part of a century. At that point, they had Russia was really their closest ally, so much so that they stood by Serbia at the start of World War One. Also because they had a lot of latter-day Soviet equipment there. They had that lifeline to Russia for a little bit, but that eventually petered out for obvious reasons. Russia had their own problems they had to deal with. Yeah. They couldn't spare as much as they would have liked to their Serbian brothers. But really, what I found to be sad and kind of heartbreaking about the whole thing was you had the consolidated Yugoslav Air Force broken up into all of these different parts. It used to be part of the whole slowly die off in sections because a lot of the legacy aircraft, they just stopped being able to support it. Right. And it was, I say heartbreaking because it was actually top quality gear. I think what a lot of people forget is that of the countries in Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia was actually in the best shape of all of them. They really didn't take orders from Moscow. They weren't technically behind the Iron Curtain. And they had what was probably the closest thing to a Western style standard of living. And you really see that reflected in how they maintained their military throughout the 1980s. Of course, it all went to hell in a handbasket after Tito died and different republics.
Yeah, boy, he is a forgotten 20th century, I wouldn't say hero, but like he's massive, his ability to hold that country together. And just for people so there are people that are like, I am Serb, done. That's it. That's all they'll ever be. Right. Yeah. And then, by the way, Montenegro and all these other places that are all part of this whole thing. But we were sitting in this farmer's house and we were talking, trying to sort all this stuff out. This is back in '96. And he's like, oh, you know what? We're Bosnian Croats. I was like, oh, okay, well, common. We're expecting that. We were talking about the Serbs. Like the guy's like, well, hold on, my dad's a Serb, and I'm like, wait, hold on, what? You're all three in one. Yeah. He's like, well, my dad's a Serb, but we're Bosnian Croats, and it's so hard to understand. Yeah, like the tethers of like what they hold on to and what they don't hold on to. And it's crazy. And so when we think we understand these things, just keep in mind that's true in every part of the world. Like wherever you go, it's particularly obvious and open in the former Yugoslavian states. But I mean, Sunni, Shia, all that stuff, it all gets really complicated. Yeah. That's not really about airplanes and stuff, but just for the audience, understand like these wars are very complicated. We just talked about Israel and Iran about an hour and a half ago. So, but the main thing I want to say here, everybody, is read Bandit. MiG-29, you've heard so much about it already. Get the book, you buy two. That's what I always say. What do you want to say in closing before we go?
Well, to any number of our listeners and viewers out there, I say thank you all for tuning in. And Pete, of course, thanks for having me on the show. As always, I love speaking to you and broadcasting our conversations to the wider audience out there. So.
Yeah, and we got another exciting one coming up that I'm particularly excited about. So we'll talk about that later. But I'm super stoked. Thanks for doing that. Everybody else, thank you for watching. That's 2 today, and there'll be